Welcome to A Taste of Tomorrow. We are joined by Dr. Matthew Ruby from La Trobe University, who is a lecturer in psychology, to discuss the psychology of what we eat. Matthew, what are some of the challenges people encounter when trying to make food choices or healthy and sustainable food choices?
Sure. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play here, and probably the biggest one that immediately comes to mind is there is so much conflicting information out there about what foods are healthy, what foods aren't healthy, what foods are sustainable, what foods aren't, that oftentimes people have difficulty navigating this information. So, you look at one source and it says, oh, it's more sustainable to buy locally produced meat than it is to have quinoa flown in from overseas. And, well, depending on exactly what that meat is and where the quinoa is coming from, that may or may not be true. There's just so many moving pieces in terms of what makes a food sustainable.
I love that you say that, because that's really something we want to get across with this A Taste of Tomorrow. Is there's so much complexity that there's really no one food that's all good or all bad. It's really a lot of grey in there. But we are trying to highlight, some of the foods that are more nutritious or more sustainable. Yes. On that sort of edge of the scale. But how can we convince people to make changes in the way that they eat to make healthier choices?
Yes. Well, again, there's a lot of sort of countervailing winds that people often have to go up against here. So many of us are a little set in our ways in terms of what foods we like to eat. A lot of us have a routine, we have our favorite foods, and we don't really like being told, oh, you now have to give up your favorite food, whatever that is. So the idea is to encourage people to make these shifts, but in ways that still retain the joy and the pleasure and the meaning that they derive from their food. So, if somebody's favorite food in the world is, I don't know, a cheeseburger, to try and find some variant of that that's more sustainable, that they can still enjoy those taste sensations, that flavor profile, but perhaps not have so much of an impact on the environment. Whether that's plant-based meat or whether that's finding ways to source the ingredients a bit more sustainably. There's different degrees of sustainability. It's hard to say that a food either is or isn't sustainable. It's really a question of degree.
Yeah, agreed. So, nutritionists around the world are advising us that a flexitarian diet, a largely plant-based diet, is really the direction we should be going. But what kind of conflicts are people having for those people who have a largely meat-based diet?
Yeah, so that is a real concern for a lot of people. We're being told by countless organizations, predominantly plant-based or plant-based is the way to go, but many people around the world do eat a lot of meat. And here in Australia in particular, the per capita meat consumption is not too much under, I think, 100 kilos a year last I checked. It's a lot of meat. And there's a lot of things that contribute to that. So many people have these really deeply ingrained beliefs that eating meat is necessary for health, that it's natural, that it's normal, and that it's nice tasting. People eat meat because it tastes good, generally speaking. So, getting around those beliefs can be a bit of a challenge, and convincing people that, okay, perhaps you don't need to cut out meat completely, but do you really need to eat that much of it on such a regular basis? Is that strictly necessary for your health, or are you doing it because it just tastes good and it's convenient?
Yeah, I really like the idea of sort of, that reduction or meat once a week, those kind of things where you're getting people to not cut it out, but reduce is interesting. But what about meat alternatives? How do you see insects fitting into diets in future?
Sure. So I'll deal with meat alternatives in general and insects specifically. So in the past few years, there's been an absolute flood of new products into the market in the sort of alternative protein sector. So you see things like Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, Just Foods, all of these different things that are mimicking the taste, smell, texture of any traditionally animal-derived proteins that are out there that have become quite popular and quite trendy in many different places. And this is a conversation I routinely have with one of my nutritionist colleagues. It's potentially a little bit risky if people jump on that bandwagon in the wrong way. So there's some products out there that are specifically designed to be more or less nutritionally equivalent to the traditional protein sources that we get, where you can sub them one to one and you'll still get the essential nutrients that you need. And then there's other alternative proteins out there that taste amazing, smell fantastic, have a really similar texture to meat, but nutritionally, you take a look at them, there's no iron, there's no B12, there's not really anything in there except for protein, fat, and lots of salt. So
I have noticed
really being
very
mindful of
salty.
if you're switching, yeah, if you're switching to those, make sure you're getting something that's nutritious and doesn't just taste good. And a lot of the products out there haven't really gotten on board with the whole fortifying or supplementation aspect. Now, one interesting alternative protein source that you flagged is insects. So this is something that I do take a look at in my research is the practice of eating insects around the world, how people feel about that, what their beliefs are about that, and the sort of things that predict their willingness to try it. So for a lot of people in Australia and many Western cultural contexts, the idea of eating insects is this really confronting, sort of disgusting thought. You know, why would I want to eat a cricket or a cockroach or a silkworm? That's horrible. But around the world, about 1 billion people do it on a regular basis, and they generally enjoy eating insects. So it's very much a sort of culturally anchored thing, but if you're used to it, it's not that unusual. And you go to some people in those cultures, and if you tell them, oh, in Australia, people like to take cow's milk and let it curdle and then scoop out those chunks and press it into forms and let it sit for a bit longer and then eat that, which is a very crude way of describing the cheese making process. It's probably not completely accurate, but basically you're eating rotted milk when you're eating cheese. But many people say, oh, but cheese is delicious. It's a perfectly normal thing to eat, because to them it is. But for somebody who doesn't grow up eating that, it's probably just as strange, as confronting as the idea of eating insects is.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. I offered crickets to my children, some cricket biscuits and then some actual
Yeah.
crickets, and they gave it a go because they don't have these preconceptions that we do often as adults, that it's something different, So I think, yeah, there's a lot of education that can be done from a very young age in terms of what other food sources there are that we could be capturing, that are eaten, as you said, very commonly in other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So what could we change about crickets?
Crickets are one of the more popular insects that are being produced for consumption, but I don't know if they're necessarily the ideal insect that we should be focusing on. So there's a fair body of research out there showing that what you feed to crickets really impacts how well they grow, how well they survive until they reach the size at which they're then killed for consumption. And early on, it was thought, oh, you can feed them on food waste. That'll be fine. It's a great way of capturing that waste stream and turning it into something useful. But there's been some studies showing that, generally speaking, crickets don't do super well on industrial scale food waste. Maybe on smaller quantities of higher quality food waste, they might do okay, or on things like grains or, relatively nutritious stuff that could be directly fed to humans. So it really is a question of what it is that you're feeding them and just how efficient the food is going to be that comes out of that.
I'm quite intrigued by the idea of feeding insects to livestock and whether that is a feasible proposition as well. I mean, is that more sustainable?
That is a good question, and that is something that I'm actually doing revisions on a paper about right now, is how people feel about eating insects directly, indirectly as feed to livestock that they then consume, or as an ingredient in food for their dogs. And people's feelings are mixed, but they're reasonably open to feeding it to their dogs for the most part, which I think is a bit more efficient. Or we should have looked at it for cats. Companion animals that are obligate carnivores that need animal protein. I think insects could be a really interesting way of doing that. But if you're using edible food to feed insects and then feed those insects to animals that are then killed and eaten by people, I don't really see the efficiency there. If you're able to raise the insects on actual waste, then yes, I could see that as an improvement in efficiencies, but then you still have the issues that come with livestock. Something that I'm a bit more excited about is the black soldier fly. So black soldier fly larvae in particular, they can eat just about anything, including poo, and they turn out quite well as a result of it. So they can grow off of almost anything. They grow very quickly. They have an extremely rapid life cycle. And for those who are concerned about the ethical aspects of killing them, they conveniently go into torpor after they stuff themselves silly as larvae. So as far as we know, they're unconscious and don't feel pain in that period. So if they were killed then, theoretically, no suffering would be involved.
So do you think then something like the black soldier fly could fit into a vegan or a vegetarian diet?
So again, that's going to come down to how people are practicing veganism or vegetarianism and what that means to them, what their motives are. So there's a lot of different definitions out there for what vegan or vegetarian means. And from my travels around the world, in some places people think that vegan means gluten-free, or it means that you eat fish but not other animals. But the definition of veganism that I like to use is the one used by the UK Vegan Society, which is basically that veganism is the practice of excluding, as far as possible and practicable, and I think that's really important, the use of animals for food, clothing, and entertainment. So the idea is that in some places it's impossible to do it 100% all of the time, but you do the best that you can. And yeah, some people, if they're doing it for reasons of health, they'd probably take a look at the nutritional properties of insects and make their decision based off of that. If they're doing it for environmental reasons, they'll look at the impact on sustainability. If they're doing it for reasons of animal rights or animal welfare, then presumably that will be shaped by the extent to which they have concerns about insects, the extent to which they think insects are suffering or not. And generally speaking, we find that people are concerned a lot less about insects than they are about other types of animal out there, largely because of perceptions about the extent to which they do or don't suffer.
Matthew, I have one last question, which is, what is your favorite recipe, or what recipe could you recommend that's both healthy, sustainable and nutritious?
Something that I've become really fond of is doing various things with chickpea flour. In the evening, I'll mix up that with some fresh chopped up veggies and make like a little frittata out of it. Really quick, really simple, can change it up by putting in different spices, different vegetables, and very sustainable.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.